Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
I asked, first of all, that we not go to the quorum call. Is that right? And I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to discuss two important issues that we won't have the chance to debate because we are unable to take up the defense authorization bill. Let me start with the need for repeal of the discriminatory don't ask, don't tell policy. We're so close to making an historic accomplishment that I think we'll be able to look back on with pride. And it's also simply just the right thing to do. This country is long past ready for it, and it's the right thing because the don't ask, don't tell policy has been costly for our military. Treating gays and lesbians unequally because of their sexual orientation just doesn't make sense to me. We should not be denying gay and lesbian Americans the ability to serve our nation simply because of who they are. We should not make them lie in order to serve. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, endorsed the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He put it in this way, and I quote, "I cannot escape being troubled by the fact that we have in place a policy which forces young men and women to lie about who they are in order to defend their fellow citizens. For me, personally, it comes down to integrity. Theirs as individuals and ours as an institution." End quote. But as I said, this isn't just about the right thing to do. The country is ready for it, and the military is ready for it. Things have changed since 1993. The country is now way ahead of us on this issue. A Washington Post ABC News poll in February 2010 showed that 75% of Americans believe that gay and lesbian Americans should be able to serve openly in the United States military. 75%. There's almost nothing that we can get 75% of the country to agree on these days. The country has been steadily moving in this direction for some time. In 1993, 44% of those surveyed favored this. It was up to 62% in 2001, and now we're at 75%. Multiple other polls reinforce this result. The country is way past being ready for this change, and so is the military. Do we need to think carefully about how to implement repeal? Yes. And that's why the Pentagon is undertaking a comprehensive review of how to implement the repeal. But is there any reason to think unit cohesion or military readiness is going to be negatively affected? No. There simply is no reason to think that. In fact, let's look to the military's own thinking on this question. A recent article in Joint Force Quarterly concluded, quote, "There is no scientific evidence to support the claim that unit cohesion will be negatively affected if homosexuals serve openly," unquote. No scientific evidence. Let me also briefly tell you about my experience. Before I was a senator, I did a number of USO tours over the years. On each tour, I was more and more impressed with the men and women of the military. This is between 1999 and 2006. I did 7 tours. The last 4 years, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. We go and Kuwait. And I go with a tour of very eclectic tour of guys and women. Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, country western artists, almost all of whom were very right-wing. And we love each other because we went on these tours. Let me tell you about one show I did. I'm not going to say what base it was. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. We did a 4-hour show. This is the 4th year we did this with a sergeant major of the Army. We did a 4-hour show because we found out that the troops loved the show. because it was a little bit of home. And during the show, I was kind of the co-host with a beautiful woman named Leanne Tweeden. And we'd do comedy routines, and we'd introduce the music, we'd introduce the cheerleaders. I'd go out and do a monologue. And this is something I would do, I'd done for a number of years. And I'd go out and I'd say, you know, I've done now 7 USO tours, and every year I'm just more and more impressed in the military, except one thing I don't get. It's this whole don't ask, don't tell policy. And now it's about 28 degrees where I'm talking, and there's maybe a couple thousand troops. Most of them are standing, some are in bleachers. And this is like 3 hours into the show, but they're just loving the show. And I said, but there's one thing I don't understand. It's this don't ask, don't tell policy. I mean, we all know that brave gay men and women have served in our country's uniform throughout its history. And well, yeah, we have this policy. I mean, take, for example, General Smith. Then I pointed to the commander of the base. I said, now here is one of the bravest men ever in the history of our country to don our nation's uniform in battle, and yet he's one of the gayest men I've ever met. And they started laughing and cheering. I said, now why should General Smith have to stay in the closet when he's such a great leader of men? General Smith, stand up and wave. And he got up and waved, and everyone cheered. And in the bleachers, there was a group of women soldiers who cheered extra loud and waved at him, and he waved back at them. And at the end of the show, the general, but at the very end of the show, we sang American Soldier by Toby Keith. I don't know if you know that song, but it's a beautiful song. And I always have this from doing USO tours, but seeing soldiers with their arms around each other and crying and singing. I don't do it for the money. I got bills that I can't pay. And at the end of the show, the general came up and he gave this beautiful frame with an American flag that had flown over the base. And he gave it to every member of our troop. And when he gave it to me, he said, Al, keep telling those don't ask, don't tell jokes. I think you may have some fans up there. And he pointed at those women. And later, those women came up to me and said, we're gay. And they're open. I mean, they're, I think everybody knew it. And this was 2006. This is when it was really hard for the military to recruit people. And so they gave waivers out at that time. And they gave waivers for moral waivers. And they gave waivers for people who didn't do as well in school or didn't graduate school. And I swear, if you asked every man and woman on that base, who would you rather have standing to your right and standing on your left? That gay man or that gay woman who's been serving with you the last year, or somebody who comes in here with a moral waiver? And those troops who had moral waivers, many of them served very honorably and bravely. Or someone with a cognitive waiver. Many of those flourished in the military and are doing great things. But if you ask that of them, they'd say, I want that gay soldier, I want that lesbian soldier who I know and has been on my right and on my left. All gay and lesbian service members want to be able to serve. Instead, people are getting kicked out of the military. People who don't need any moral waiver, people who don't need standards lowered for them in order to serve. People who are patriotic and courageous and who have vital, irreplaceable skills. What's more, the evidence is clear from other countries that have allowed gay and lesbian citizens to serve openly in their military. Susan Collins spoke about this today. The evidence shows there will not be a problem. Ask the Israelis, ask the Canadians, ask the British. They've all successfully implemented open service. But it's not only that the military is ready for this change. Don't ask, don't tell. It's just costly for the military. Thousands of willing and capable Americans with needed skills have been kicked out of the military because of this foolish policy, and this policy alone. These are soldiers and airmen and sailors who we've invested time and training in. We really can't afford to lose dedicated personnel with critical skills when we're engaged in 2 wars. On top of that, do we really want our military officers spending valuable time and resources investigating and kicking troops out of the military for being gay? The argument offered by some opponents is that this legislation goes back on the promise to take into account the comprehensive review being conducted by the Pentagon, but that's just a canard. Let me remind you what Secretary Gates said about the review when he testified before the Armed Services Committee back in February. Secretary Gates said, and I quote, "I fully support the President's decision. The question before us is not whether the military prepares to make this change, but how best to prepare for it. Not whether, but how." The Secretary of Defense. That process is going forward, and the provision in this bill repealing the flawed don't ask, don't tell policy does nothing to interfere with the Pentagon's process. All the provision does is repeal the existing law. It does not tell the Department of Defense how to implement the repeal. What's more, the repeal itself doesn't go into effect until after the Pentagon's comprehensive review is complete. And the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have certified that the Department of Defense has prepared the necessary policies and regulations for implementation. They also must certify that the implementation is consistent with military readiness and effectiveness, unit cohesion, and recruiting and retention. To be honest, I'm not fully satisfied with that compromise. I wanted a moratorium on discharges in the meantime, but that's the compromise, and it doesn't undercut the Pentagon's review in any way. Don't ask, don't tell makes no sense. It's foolish, it's unjust, and we must end it. The country is ready, the military is ready, and it is the right thing to do. I urge all of my colleagues to stand for equality and for common sense, and to stand up for our troops. It's long past time to end don't ask, don't tell. We will be proud that we did. Now let me turn to the DREAM Act, which also would have come up if we had been able to get cloture and move to the Defense Authorization Bill. Minnesota is what today is what it is today, because we welcomed immigrants with open arms. We welcomed the Swedes, who first tilled our fields and built our railroads. We welcomed the Norwegians, who thrived in our lumber industry and who founded choirs that remain the best in the world today. We welcomed the Danes, who made our state a leader in dairy farming. We welcomed the Germans and the Finns and the Poles and the Czechs. In fact, from the time we were admitted to the Union in 1858 until 1890, no less than 1/3 of Minnesotans were born abroad.